Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à la troisième séance de la 9e saison de Recherche en lumière. Nous sommes ravis de pouvoir donner un visage public à la recherche à l'école de musique Schulich. With this series, we aim to bring alive the various kinds of research in and on music, with the aim of better understanding the inner workings of the magical world of musical practice and scholarship illustrated with live music. We'll have the first prize winner of the Research Alive Student Prize, Ellis Reyes, on March 11th. Ellis is a doctoral student in musicology who will present the pipe and tambour player as dance master and knowledge keeper in the Viceroyalty of Peru. And this prize was generously funded by Jill de Villafranca and David Kustik. Today's session is presented by Ben Duinker, who's a researcher, percussionist, educator, and choral singer. And Ben was raised in a musical family in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And curiously enough, he first studied civil engineering before moving to the bright side of the force and switched career paths at 21 toward music. Ben holds a MMus in percussion performance and a PhD in music theory from McGill University. And he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto before coming back to McGill as a researcher with the Actor, Analysis, Creation, and Teaching of Orchestration project. He also performs in tours with the Montreal-based quartet Architect Percussion, and will entertain us tonight from two of his perspectives, united into one stream of thought as music theorist and performer, speaking of music performance as is analysis. Ben.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks all for being here, and a special thanks as well to the entire, it's not called Concerts and Publicity anymore. What's it called? Communications and production team. Sorry, I know it's still C&P, for making this such a seamless and welcoming experience. I'm very, very happy to be here, and thanks all of you who are beaming in online to watch today too. It's nice to know that you're there. I don't see you literally. So 15 years ago, 2009, on this very stage, as you can see on the slide, I competed in what was then called the OSM Standard Life Competition. I was just beginning to take solo percussion seriously at that time, and the amount of repertoire I had to learn for this 3-round competition was, at that time, I say at that time, but still would be for me now, quite staggering. The rules also stated that competitors had to memorize a majority of their repertoire. And moreover, I had to learn a concerto in the final round, and the one that I really, really wanted to perform had, at that time, no piano reduction. So in a fit of classic Ben Duinker stubbornness, I took it upon myself both to memorize all of my repertoire, not something I was used to doing, and still am not very good at, and also create a piano reduction myself of this 25-minute concerto for percussion and orchestra. And I did all this for practical gain. I wanted to compete, and I wanted to win. But it quickly became apparent to me that the strategies that I was using to aid my memorization process and to speedily and tastefully create this piano reduction, the clock was ticking and I had to learn it, these processes or these strategies were somehow also analytical. I wasn't sitting in a classroom, that's sure. I wasn't doing analysis assignments for homework. But what I was doing was very similar. And it got me thinking about how the work that goes into preparing, improving, and developing one's artistic voice as a performer can all, in a sense, be described as analysis. And this idea stuck with me throughout my doctorate and eventually became the focus of my professional work as a Chaque postdoc at the University of Toronto between 2020 and 2022. Which brings us to today's topic, performance is as analysis. So over the next hour or so, I'd like to make the case that musical performance, including all the prep that goes into it, and analysis, these concepts that in our musical education sometimes are presented to us as distinct, are, to me, really not distinct at all. In fact, I would go further and argue that performance itself is an analytical act, as long as we believe two important things. First, that analytical output, whether it's a performance, an essay, a lecture, or what have you, can assume myriad forms. And second, that the type of knowledge we generate through these outputs may vary. So we'll begin by investigating just what is meant by these two terms, analysis and performance, or at least what I think they mean. We'll then explore their intersection in both practical and epistemological contexts. And the practical context that we'll focus on has to do with interpretive difficulty, or we could say, the things that make learning and performing a piece of music difficult. For me, one of those was memorization in that case so many years ago. But as we'll see, there are many places where difficulty can come into play, and we can bring it into this discussion. And after I've talked your ear off a little bit, we'll get to the music and see how some of these ideas coalesce in the learning and performance of contemporary percussion repertoire. Although I would argue as well that these thoughts and these ideas can apply to other repertoires as well. It's just that I'm a percussionist, so that's what we're going to do today. And I'm lucky to have with me today Noam Bierstone, with whom I frequently collaborate in our quartet Architect Percussion. And I'll bring Noam up in a little while. He's going to generously demonstrate some excerpts from the work Mani Diche by the Italian composer Pierluigi Bellone. And I will perform part of the work Rebond by the Greek-French composer Yanis Xenakis. And through these performances, we'll unpack how engaging with the difficulties that they pose, these pieces pose, generates abundant analytical knowledge, which can be communicated just as effectively in performance as it can be in written prose or in lecture. So I was lucky enough in Halifax to attend a public high school that offered academic music courses. So, we would learn history and analysis in this class rather than just, have that be an add-on to band or orchestra rehearsals. This was a separate credit course. Coincidentally, I then attended a university, not this one, for my undergrad, where they promptly did not recognize any of those courses, and I had to redo that entire curriculum for my first year. But my teacher in those high school courses, himself a McGill alum, Alec Tilley, used to tell us that music, and I'm liberally paraphrasing here because that was quite a while ago, and I didn't write it down. He used to tell us that analysis would increase our understanding and appreciation of music, and that made sense enough to me then. And it's stuck with me as a sort of a general description of what analysis can be. And it seems to also jive well with something that the late David Lewin wrote, namely that the goal of analysis is simply to hear the work better. So better here can perhaps mean value added, we could say. We value or cherish a musical work more thanks to analysis, either analysis that we've done or that we've been made privy to. Better may also mean more discerning. Analysis can help us hear things that we didn't hear before, in turn changing our perspective, perhaps making us newly critical of the work, or encouraging us even to discard our previously held opinions. But better doesn't mean best. Better is also not unidirectional. We can, for a lifetime, analyze to hear better, and we can go forward and backwards, and we always have room to grow. So it's in this understanding of perpetuity in Lewin's hearing better that attracts me to another theorist, Judy Lochhead's writings on music analysis. And she writes that, quote, analysis focuses not on a structure, but on the emergent structurings that a musical work generates in listening contexts understood as historically, socially, and culturally contingent, end quote. So this description is perhaps even more perpetual than Lewin's. Here we have emergent structurings that are individual and completely new in each analytical context. And what's so fascinating about this description, too, is that it acknowledges an ecosystem of the analyst and the analyzed. It encourages us to think about how we are, in fact, analyzing ourselves when we are analyzing a work of music. For performers, this is extremely important, as we'll soon see. Okay, what about performance? What is it? I ask this not because I don't think we know what it is in this room, but more because I think it's worth unpacking what the Music Academy has broadly thought it is for most of the past century, I would say. When we, do analysis at music school, we very often either annotate or at least consult notated scores. By extension, even if we don't say so explicitly, we are treating this score quite often as representative of the work of music, even if, the work of music at hand. And this approach risks leaving the performer and the performances out of the discussion. When analysis considers only the score or even simply begins with a consultation of a score, it risks, I'm not accusing it of always doing this, but it risks tacitly assuming that the work will be performed accurately or indeed perfectly. But as we know, performances are always in some way or another imperfect instantiations of notated music. And even if Noam's performances later seem perfect to you, I can guarantee you that they probably aren't. And mine definitely won't even seem perfect, so there's no worry there. Many philosophers of music have debated whether a performer's perfect rendering of a notated score is desirable or even possible. Stephen Davies believes that a performance of a work should ideally match the work's content, quote unquote, more or less, and that performers should intend to follow as much of the score's instructions as they can. Now that makes sense, notes on a page, play them accurately. It makes sense to me anyway. But it leaves something out. John Dick and Julian Dodd both argue in their own writings that this view leaves little to no room for performer agency. Specifically, Dodd writes that, quote, interpretation is required to discern what the demands of the most fundamental interpretive kind of faithfulness to the work are. And on achieving this understanding, it can sometimes become evident that meeting these demands in performance calls for departures from full score compliance. And I should add that all the emphasis in all these quotes are my own. So we have this word interpretation here. It's going to be one that we return to in a moment. So I've kind of thrown Davies and the perfect score compliance school under the bus a little bit here. Obviously, he must know that flawless absolute score compliance by performers is impossible. Indeed, a score itself can't even dictate every parameter of a performance. But by being cognizant of these limitations of both scores and performers, so scores are not exhaustively precise and performers are never perfect, we can start to think about how analysis can serve as a medium of interpretation between score and performer. Performance involves musicians entering what we might call a negotiation with scores, instruments, performance environments, and by extension, composers. And this is an idea I draw from Sharon Kanak, the well-known biographer of Yanis Xenakis. And in such negotiations, choices and concessions must often be made, at times in the service of musical narrative, and at times due simply to the difficult demands of the score. So we have these two activities that I've just described very crudely here, analysis and performance. And earlier I proposed that in many cases that these are one and the same. It's just a question of what type of knowledge is being generated. When I'm poring over a score of a musical work, whether it's on a computer screen or at my desk on paper, with a pencil or a highlighter nearby to take notes, I'm acquiring a specific type of knowledge about the work. We'll call it right now that knowledge. So I'm perhaps coming to know that the work uses a certain musical grammar, that it demonstrates formal relationships between its various sections, or that it contains a certain level of ambiguity, perhaps. By contrast, when I am learning to perform that same score, the knowledge that I am acquiring is often quite different, and we can call this how knowledge or how-to knowledge. I'm learning how to play it, how to express what I want to express, or how to get through the difficult passages, perhaps. And so all this that and how gets a little bit wordy, but fortunately for us, we have German, and German has a fix for this. So German has more than one word for the verb to know, and it can be represented, among other words, by wissen, this is that knowledge, and können, which would be, in this case, how knowledge or how-to knowledge. And this is a distinction that Daphne Leong makes quite clearly in her 2019 book, Performing Knowledge, where she explores points of intersection and the divergence in the types of knowledge produced and gained through analysis and performance. The main thrust of Leong's book is that through analysis, analysts primarily utilize wissen knowledge, while through performance, musicians primarily utilize können knowledge. And because Leong takes the important step of co-writing each chapter of this book with a performer, her research shows that a productive bilateral knowledge exchange between analytical and performance knowledge is possible in music scholarship. But here I am still treating analysis and performance as separate activities, which I vowed I would argue against, and now I'm finally going to make that argument. So I propose an extension of Leong's idea here to state that, regardless of the type of knowledge generated through these two activities, the activities, that is, analysis and performance, facilitating this knowledge generation, the activities facilitating this knowledge generation are all inherently analytical in some way. Annotating a musical score to understand, how Beethoven structured the tonality in the Waldstein Sonata is no more, to me anyway, analytical than figuring out how to navigate its myriad challenges at the keyboard. You might think that this is merely a slight shift in wording, and in a sense you're right. But this shift has several positive and important ramifications. So first, it more sensitively addresses the self-identification of performer analysts like me, who quite often don't see much distinction in learning a piece of music at their instrument or marking up the score at their desk. Second, it, in my opinion, proactively dismantles any barriers that students may experience when they go through their analysis courses in undergrad and aren't constantly encouraged to think about how what they learn there relates to what they do in the practice room or on the recital stage. And third, and perhaps most important, in what we might call here the Anglo-American Academy, knowledge transfer between professional analysts and performers has traditionally been unidirectional, beginning with analysis and terminating with performance. As Joel Lester has written, this transfer risks forming a hierarchy wherein performance is thought to merely validate an analysis. And he proposes that we, quote, challenge the assumption that communication need take place solely when analysts give directions to performers, and to argue that more reciprocal discourse would enhance our understanding of music theoretical issues as well as performance issues, end quote. And one possible solution to this dilemma is by simply collapsing these two concepts of analysis and performance into one collective activity. The work of musicologist Bethany Lowe proposes just this solution. So she conceives of interpretation as an intermediary between analysis and performance. And here's a diagram that I have plucked from her article on this topic, showing how interpretation is the common element between what we have up until now in this lecture being called analysis and performance. And according to this diagram, interpretation is the site of intersection between these two activities. It's a very helpful concept to map that hierarchy that Joel Lester decried, because here we can see how a unidirectional knowledge transfer might occur. So as a bit of a foreshadowing to our discussion of musicology with Noam, we could imagine perhaps me producing an analysis of this work and Noam, the performer, learning it for a recital. And perhaps I had developed a nuanced and thoughtful interpretation of the work's structure in my work, and I shared it with Noam and I encouraged him to consider it when he was learning the work. I would thus be hoping that my analysis would influence or inform the way that Noam performed. Needless to say, if this was the relationship that Noam and I had actually cultivated over this work, I doubt he would have joined us today. But Lester was onto something here. There are a lot of analyses, some very recent in the sort of the published world, that essentially do address performers and performances this way. And using Lowe's diagram helps us see the potentially troubling knowledge hierarchy of this approach. So let's consider an alternate scenario. Perhaps I develop that same interpretation of musicology from my analysis, but before trying to pawn my analysis off on Noam, I instead invite him to describe and reflect what analytical knowledge he has gained from learning the piece. Maybe some of his knowledge complements mine, maybe some of it contradicts mine. Maybe his interpretation focuses on aspects of the work that I hadn't considered. Maybe it ignores aspects of the work that I had really focused on. No matter the specifics in these regards, treating this central interpretation node as a site for knowledge exchange will only ever make our individual interpretations stronger, more multifaceted, and more robust. In this bilateral scenario, I'm following not only my own intuitions on how best to develop a deeper, more holistic understanding of musical work, but I'm also following similar ideas of others who have advocated for the same. So Daniel Boralski writes that, quote, by listening to what performers emphasize and obscure, and to how they respond to other performers and compositions, we allow them to prompt us to ask new questions and to hear new answers, end quote. So what might these new questions and answers be? One particular question family that has fascinated me has to do with interpretive difficulty. Why are things felt as difficult when we learn them? How do performers, myself or otherwise, deal with these? And how does that dealing affect how we get through the piece? And then, how does that determine how the audience understands what we're doing? So to pique my curiosity with these questions, in 2022, I published a little exploratory study where I interviewed 5 musicians who have built their careers largely around being prolific champions of contemporary music. And I spoke at length with each of them about their thoughts on difficulty, how they deal with it, and what ramifications it has on how they interpret their repertoire. In each conversation, we focused closely on one specific piece they have performed often, and I had also done my own work on each of these pieces so that I arrived prepared for our interview. And I encountered two broad themes in our conversations. First, it became quickly clear to me that navigating difficulty requires the performer to make decisions, implicitly and explicitly, about what to emphasize or obscure. And in this sense, performers do become analysts, as Boralski argues. And second, I realized that difficulty as performers seem to encounter it, and this resonated with my own experience with it, seems to manifest in several broad overlapping categories. So one way we can show these categories is with a little Venn diagram here, and I'll go through each of them in turn. So difficulty of accuracy concerns not only literally the accurate performance of a musical score, though we know that that has limits, but also the ability to reproduce that accuracy day in and day out. Difficulty of narrative concerns the challenges inherent in crafting a convincing and or recognizable narrative in performance. And what's interesting here about contemporary music, and especially music composed for percussion instruments of unfixed pitch, is the general lack of consistent formal and tonal frameworks that underpin these compositions. Difficulty of latitude pertains to the interpretive choices that musicians must make. Such choices can be broad, in works with unspecified instrumentation, for example, or they can be very specific and involve minute details like fingering choices, hand position, or bowings. And finally, difficulty of control is perhaps the most slippery to define, as it really overlaps with the other three. Difficulty of control involves the quest to balance the outcome of a desired interpretation with the finite physical capabilities of the performer's body. And if anyone here is a performer, they know exactly what I mean when I talk about finite physical capabilities. So let's move now to the first piece, and this is probably a good time for Noam to join us on stage. So musicque for solo percussionist is nearly 29 minutes long, and we're just going to look at excerpts of it today. So from Italian, mani means hand, and from Greek, dike means trial or justice. And the period between these two terms is meant to imply their separability. Musicque is one of a handful of works for solo percussion composed by Billone, each bearing this mani prefix. And the 29-minute duration of this piece is worth noting because it is the endurance required to perform it in total that is one of the things that makes it so difficult to perform. And this is a good time for me to properly introduce you, Noam. For those of you here who don't already know who Noam is, in my opinion, he's one of the most captivating and thoughtful percussionists you'll see, especially in this country, but pretty much anywhere. He co-curates an experimental music series in Montreal called Nohe Banda. And among other projects, he performs together with me in the Montreal-based quartet Architect Percussion. And on one of my last slides, I have the dates of our next two concerts in these two series. So we were both students here in percussion at McGill. We met when Noam was beginning his bachelor's degree, and I was in the middle of my master's, I think. And Noam eventually took off to France and did a master's in Paris. And he returned to McGill for his doctorate, where he focused his research on solo repertoire that calls for the performer to go beyond what we might call traditional percussion playing techniques. And it's probably already evident that that's what you're going to see in a few minutes here. So Noam was, if I'm not mistaken, the second percussionist and remains one of only a handful of very intrepid musicians to attempt learning and performing this piece, musicque. This demanding work tests the performer's physical and mental endurance, requiring of them prolonged periods of contorted and balanced postures to execute gestures across a bespoke instrument setup dictated in the score. So repertoire for solo percussion doesn't normally specify instrument setup like this. We often figure it out ourselves when we're learning the piece, how to place all the instruments, meaning that Billone, the fact that he did include one means that for him, performance gesture must have been front of mind, an aspect over which he wished to exert some degree of compositional control. So the performer holds two Tibetan singing bowls, and they use these to strike a Chinese opera gong worn around the neck. You can show us that maybe. yeah. A large tie gong laid flat on a stand in front of the performer. And 2 suspended metal plates situated one on each side of the performer. And the singing bowls are, of course, also struck together, scraped, and used as muting devices on other instruments, as Noam already showed us. So Noam was one of my interviewees in that study I discussed earlier. And I'd now like to visit 2 sites of difficulty that he identified in Manitique that necessitated careful planning and consideration on his part to mitigate. And the first one has to do with difficulty of accuracy. So one thing that I was really surprised to learn, although it makes perfect sense in hindsight, is that given the 29-minute duration of this piece, Noam only rarely practiced it in full, doing full run-throughs of it. Only usually right before performances, or the days leading up to it. But instead, he would focus on small sections, striving to maintain consistency between them in both sound production and in gesture. So we can recall here the importance that Villone places on gesture in his works. So here's one such gesture that requires a degree of consistency. So on the slide we see this little down and up arrow, and Noam's going to show us what that means. So it's really just a scrape down and up on the chest, the gong worn on the chest. And this gesture appears frequently throughout the work in a variety of different contexts. Noam told me that in addition to the challenges of performing precisely the same way, each time and in these different contexts, the incumbency on him to do so enables audience members to then understand it as perhaps a unifying element throughout the piece, almost like a leitmotif in a Wagner opera or a specific drum fill on a Motown record. It's really just the same thing. It's a signpost that people come to recognize. So, how to confront this difficulty of accuracy? When he was learning the piece, Noam told me that he would isolate all the occurrences of this gesture and practice them sequentially, skipping any intervening material. And this approach not only helped him achieve the consistency he desired, but it also enabled him to focus on jettisoning any ancillary gestures or sounds that distracted from the effective gestures, the ones literally required to perform and produce sound. So Noam would only combine gestures once he could accurately execute them. His next challenge was to consider how larger sections of the piece create some sort of coherent structure for audiences to understand. And the bespoke instrumentation here and the musical language of this piece places much responsibility on the performer to communicate coherence and directionality, because the audience has less background understanding of this language since it's unique to Villone. Hands up if you've ever seen another piece use exactly this instrument setup. And yeah, exactly. So it's very unique to this context. And in one example of how he has decided to communicate structure in his interpretation, Noam showed me this excerpt on the slide, which occurs almost right at the beginning of the piece. And perhaps it's a good time to play this now. More time to drink, but yeah, that's good. Thanks. So this only takes a few seconds to perform, but the percussionist here uses nearly every technique called for in the piece. We see this is one of these like here it all is moments very early on. So we might think of this almost like a painter's palette. Each color, the raw ingredients for the painting are present. So these are the raw ingredients for the piece. And when we understand the significance of this moment, we quickly see how it comes back in various forms throughout the piece. And according to Noam, not only are these little gestures like the down-up, signposty, let's say, but these larger sections become almost signposty as well. Now, I could have probably I'd like to think anyway, with a doctorate, I could have found these similar passages myself through analysis, and perhaps even described some structural importance to them. And then I could have gone so far as looking for that importance when I was listening to a performance of it. But learning all of this from Noam, to me, is much more valuable because it shows how musicians are capable of bringing their own analysis to life in performance. And in this sense, performance is the vehicle of communication for analytical knowledge. So this same principle holds for our next example, which has to do with the overall form or structure of the work. Now, even if Noam has been successful with creating consistency in his down-up gestures and these phrases, I, the audience member, still might want to make more sense of what's happening in this work on a global scale. And I remember thinking this when I watched Noam perform it in 2017, thinking to myself, how do I, or more accurately, how can I, or maybe even more accurately, can I get out of a moment-to-moment listening strategy here and start thinking about sort of longer range what I'm hearing and seeing. And maybe not. I don't really remember what I decided I was able to do in that moment, but this question still intrigued my analyst brain to look into the piece, and namely to learn more about its large-scale structure. And so when I eventually looked at the score for the first time, I didn't get very far. This didn't clear up matters for me very much. As we've seen, the notation is very specific. It takes a while to figure out what it all means. And even then, it's not all that easy to figure out what's going on when you're just sitting there looking at the score. So it was both a relief and a surprise to me when I spoke to Noam about large-scale form, because his engagement with this concept is steadfastly practical in nature. Noam characterizes the form of musicque in terms of the physical endurance required to perform it. He told me that, and this is something I also didn't know, that Bilone often structures his works so that, we might think of, I'm going to preface this a bit, we might think of structure as maintaining some sort of high point towards the end of the piece. We like to think of, we've heard about the golden ratio before, but we also think about, development, presentation, development, and getting to some moment, and then, we eventually get to the end of the piece. That type of moment for Bilone, according to Noam, is that he often structures his works so that the most physically difficult part comes around 2/3 of the way through the piece. He told me, Noam did, that it starts to get really difficult here around page 10 of a 19-page score, and that it reaches maybe what we would call peak exhaustion or peak difficulty around, that's funny, where's that? Oh, there it is, okay. Around page 14, and this is an excerpt from page 14. Here, the performer spends approximately 90 seconds with their arms straight out to each side, aggressively scraping and muting and striking the metal plates with the Tibetan bowls. And I should also add that not only is Noam doing all those things, but he's also supporting their weight when he pushes them out. So it's quite a bit of work. So on the score, however, this doesn't necessarily stand out as some big moment. The sounds themselves aren't new at this point. We've had other passages on one instrument before. And this isn't novel by page 14, and it doesn't somehow seem bigger. So in short, there is little in the score to characterize this as some sort of structural high point. But from the performer's perspective, that's exactly what it is. This 90-second passage actually concludes a similarly grueling 4 minutes of performing and demands more of the performer's strength and focus than anywhere in the work hitherto. So for Noam, then, and this is actually my diagram, but it comes from my conversations with him, the large-scale form of musicque could also be considered around physicality. Pages 1 to 9 are this, less taxing opening, certainly not untaxing, but this opening part. Pages 10 to 13, we see this gradual increase in physical toll on the performer. Pages 14 and 15 are perhaps this, this pivotal point of near exhaustion. Whereas page 16, Noam gets a chance to relax a little bit, and then the piece concludes in a considerably more tranquil environment that also is a lot more comfortable and relaxing for the performer to get through. So this conception of form, from the performer's perspective, thus gives shape to the work that, at least to me, wasn't apparent in the score alone. And so what we'll do next is Noam is going to perform, without the score on the slide, but Noam is going to perform for us now roughly pages 10 to 14, if I'm not mistaken. All right. want everyone for their homework to go and find a doorway and stand there like this and push hard for about a minute or two when you go home. So to wrap up with this piece, then, what we've seen here is a performing musician doing a lot of detailed analytical work to make sense of how this gargantuan piece is put together and what responsibilities the performer has in communicating that structure to audience members. So for example here, Noam's Können knowledge, how and where these endurance challenges of simply getting through the piece has informed his Wissen knowledge, that the overall form is based largely on matters of physicality. So I would dare say then that Noam's relationship with Many DK has shown this bilateral exchange of knowledge types within itself, exemplifying how analyst and performer are, in a sense, one and the same. So I'd like to conclude now with this talk with a brief foray into a work that has been with me for a very long time, almost as far back as my serious study of percussion, which I pegged to be roughly halfway through my undergraduate degree, maybe the same moment I abandoned civil engineering. So I had heard a recording of Rebond made by the Norwegian percussionist Hans Christian Sørensen, and I was immediately hooked. It was, of course, much too difficult for me to learn at that time, although I tried. I remember sight reading it from the beginning, thinking it wasn't so difficult before, getting further and further into the piece, and there was a sort of an inverse relationship with how far I got and how many notes I was actually playing accurately. So Rebond was composed between 1987 and 1989 by Yannis Xenakis, a Greek composer who spent much of his, in fact, nearly all of his composing career in France. Toward the end of his life, and it constitutes one of his the last of several of his very famous works to feature percussion. So despite its relatively young age as a composition, Rebond has become one of the most oft-performed solo percussion works worldwide. It's a veritable classic amid a fast-growing body of solo percussion repertoire. And I was thinking about this earlier, between all the grad school auditions that use it and the performance competitions that require it, and all the recordings that are out there, I think in my life I've heard at least 100 different percussionists either perform or record this piece. And I myself have performed it or recorded it over 25 times at this point. So set in two movements, these are called A and B, Rebond is scored for a selection of skinned and wooden instruments. And in Rebond A, which is what we'll focus on today, the piece requires 7 drums arranged in ascending pitch. And so what I've got here on the slide shows you roughly, a bird's eye view of what I'm seeing on the setup and how that maps to the score. So the lowest 2 spaces are bass drums, the middle 3 are tom-toms, and the highest 2 are bongos. And I'll just is this on? Yeah. I'll just demonstrate that. So our lowest bass drum is here, second bass drum, and then 3 tom-toms and 2 bongos. So quite a wide pitch range there. So back in the day when I performed this a bit more often than I do these days, I often encountered difficulty of the type that impeded my crafting of a narrative when performing the piece. So what I'm specifically concerned with here was my task of communicating some sense of global form in the movement. So we often think about form as something perhaps a composer preoccupies themselves with when they are creating a piece, but ultimately it's the performer who must be able to communicate this musically. So thinking about form in Rebond A, there aren't many obvious section markers or section breaks in this piece, and there's actually not all that much recurring material either. The piece just keeps going and going and going until it can go no more, at which time whatever has been happening suddenly breaks down and the music almost recedes into silence. So formally speaking then, what we are dealing with here is actually quite trivial, so simple it almost borders on what we might call the banal. It is, after all, a very simple 2-note motive that begins the piece, and that sounds like this. So Rebond A involves this gradual densification of both rhythmic and pitch space, such that this opening two-note motive eventually becomes buried within or amid the accumulating musical material. And this is a measure that we see later on in the piece. But that motive is always there. It occasionally surfaces, and it ultimately, as we'll hear and see, it prevails in this new fragmented form. So it starts as a high-low motive, and it ends as a low-high motive. So we have this gradual ongoing densification of maybe texture here. Faster rhythms, more accents, more drums, less silence. And that's all great to know from a Wissen analytical perspective. But what about my sensibility as a performer? Well, for starters, I can think about this in a somewhat unilateral sense. I've generated this Wissen analysis about what happens in the score, and I can think about how to express that or highlight that in my performance. But more to the point, and more immediately pertinent for me, is the fact that Rebond A gets increasingly difficult to perform as you go. It's all well and good to think about how I as a performer can show this development process musically, but much more is at stake. For me, a way of dealing with this difficulty is to think about it in a narrative sense. Rather than it simply being about how the piece gets more complicated and difficult, it's instead about how I, with my finite capabilities as a performer, negotiate between the demands of the score, the limitations of my motor capacity, and the affordances of the instruments. And what I mean by affordances here is you have to tune them just right so that your mallets bounce off them right so that you can play the fast rhythms. Some passages are easier to play than others. Some are more idiomatic. Some of the motions between drums feel more natural. And other parts are more contorted. They invoke tension in the performer's body, and I need to consciously think about how to relax through them, and that may not always be successful. So while the piece may be slowly and unidirectionally developing musically, the nature of my engagement with it, my bodily engagement with it, is not unidirectional at all. It's back and forth and here and there. So one major factor in this whole process of negotiation involves my chosen degree of interpretive latitude. And here I don't necessarily mean choices regarding whether I'll play accurately what is on the page. I always try to do that. But rather this little but hugely consequential decision of which tempo to take, or how or whether to maintain that tempo throughout. And these really do relate to one another, as we'll see. So as you can see here, Xenakis has indicated an approximate tempo of 40 beats per minute to the quarter. And that might seem incredibly slow off the top, but we know by now that this piece gets quite dense, and I can tell you one thing, in having heard or seen all these performances, I don't think I've ever heard someone stick to 40, like click-track precision to 40 throughout this. And this is, in a sense, this is classic Xenakis. He's very well known for composing things that were or are thought to be unplayable in their notated form, but they ultimately, at the end of the day, push the boundaries of the possible, or they encourage performers to become active agents in the realization of the work. And there's so many great quotes that I've heard anecdotally or read in print of Xenakis kind of casually telling the performer, maybe they can't do it, but someone in the future can, or maybe they can in the future, or these kind of casual, like, I know it'll be fine, and these people are just scared that they're not going to be able to do it, but they do it, and they push the boundaries, and they become almost part owners in the piece when they go through this, and I'm sure all the percussionists in the room agree with me that that's what happens when you learn a piece like this. So I've got two examples from commercial recordings to show just how varied the approach to tempo can be here. And so this is the aforementioned Hans Sørensen playing the opening at 27 beats per minute. And perhaps it's like this, like he sounds like he's in a cave or something. Maybe that's why he chose to play it so slow. But here is the fastest one I can find. This is at 47 beats per minute by Yi-Sing Chen, Taiwanese percussionist based in Copenhagen. So very different feel. It's 20 beats per minute different, but that matters. It's literally almost double what Sørensen was doing. So here's a chart crudely plotting these 2 recordings and 8 others, the tempi that they take at various points in the piece. And I know that the chart has these sort of linear connections between it. Doesn't mean that there was a constant slope of tempo change. In hindsight, I probably should have used a different type of plot, but here we are. It still shows us, what it does show us though, is that really no one constantly maintains a tempo, and further to that, almost everyone at some point, really towards the end, starts slowing down. So we see, here's Steve Schick's, the curve for him. He gets quite fast in the middle of the piece, and he really drops. It's very sudden. It's very sudden towards the end. And so what this tells us is that choosing an opening tempo can have very important ramifications regarding whether that tempo is maintained, and changing tempi suddenly has in turn ramifications on whether that development of increasing complexity is expressed, or more importantly still, how the negotiation between performer, score, and instrument is maintained. And so, when I'll be fully honest here, and I'm sure he would be okay with this. When I listened to Steve Schick's recording for the first time, I thought, when I got to that point where it starts to slow down, I was like, whoa, what is going on here? Like, did he just not know that part? Obviously, Steve Schick knows this piece, but it forced me to be like, wow, the most well-renowned solo percussionist in the English-speaking world chooses to do this. This isn't an accident. And so these decisions, there's intent and there's thought behind them. So that's, I don't really know whether I prefer that, what he did, but you have to sort of think about it with that in mind, that there's a conscious decision happening here. So as a final note, let's talk a little bit about difficulty of control, because that's kind of been the elephant in the room here. I'm talking about my limitations as a performer, and often that comes to a head in this piece on whether I can stay in control, whether it's even desirable to stay in control, perhaps. What I'm interested right now are these 2 systems here. So this is actually just 2 measures, in fact. This is measure 49 and 50 of a 60 measure piece, 60 measure movement. And this is right before we get that breakdown in the development where I spoke about, silence coming back into the texture. And so that's a great Wissen observation of what's happening here. We know that, the development has reached its moment. It's kind of can go no further, and it breaks down. The Können analytical observation here is, again, that these measures are brutally difficult to play. The negotiation at this point is perhaps almost tipping in the favor of the score. Maybe Xenakis has kind of won at this point. I'm barely hanging on to any semblance of control when navigating these measures, even if it may look like I have some. And so for me, this becomes part of the piece, this struggle on the threshold, perhaps, of maintaining control over my outcome and relaxing into the inevitability that I can never maintain it 100%. Indeed, it is tempting to believe in music in general that complete control is some sort of gold standard that we all strive to achieve, but many musical works demand this balance between its pursuit and grappling with its unattainability. So these are just a few small observations about how performers know how in Rebond A leads to some very analytically based decision-making on how to craft an interpretation that is both convincing, but also respects the demands and the limitations of the score and the human body. It's this site of intersection between Wissen and Können knowledge that has made, for me, this piece so interesting for more than 20 years now, and keeps drawing me back in. I don't ever turn down a chance to see this performed. I don't think I've ever turned down a chance to perform it myself either. So before concluding with a performance of Rebond A, I want to briefly return to the main idea of this talk. That is, that performance is essentially analysis, is essentially performance. Thinking about how these 2 activities converge in their pursuit and generation of musical knowledge and their power of communicating that knowledge, it makes total sense to me when Judy Lochhead also writes that, quote, analysis generates new forms of musical behavior and it generates new modes of musical experience. So I see an immense value in situating analysis in some domain where it can encompass the creative, negotiative, and problem-solving actions of music's stage-bound performers, whether that performer is me, whether it's Noam, or whoever it is. And if we pursue analysis in this way with the goal of hearing better as per Lewin, we subscribe to Irish composer Jennifer Walsh's ideal of accepting that, quote, the bodies playing the music are part of the music. They are present, they're valid, and they inform our listening, whether subconsciously or consciously. And I'd like to conclude now with a performance of Rebond A. Thank you. I have one other person and group of people to thank, and I realized it as I was playing. Thanks Fabrice and the McGill percussion area for lending me the bass drum. And also thanks Fabrice for teaching me probably the most valuable lesson I ever had on this piece, and it's to imagine when playing those fast passages like you're touching hot elements and to move around them fast and to get away from the heat. That still sticks with me every time I play it, so I just wanted to mention that. It's some more how-to knowledge right there. I think we have now question time? Yeah.
There's a question online.
Oh, great.
From Ed Corman. Bravo, Ben. You mentioned physical constraints that make an accurate realization of a score impossible, even if it were desirable. Continue to the next comment. But there are musical contexts in which a focus on accuracy of realization might miss the point of the music, where the composition might be conceived in a way that invites a strong interpretation, rather than a precise realization.
Yeah, I think you could argue that right here, to be honest. I'm not sure if there's a response intended for that. But yeah, no, I'm thinking, yeah, I think I had to, in fact, the other movement in this piece, Rebond B, has a lot of situations where that might just be that, there is technically a possible way to perform it completely accurately, but just about no one does. And a lot of the time that's very much in the service of a strong and convincing interpretation of that movement. And the percussionists in the room probably know exactly about where I'm talking about here. But yeah, those decisions are, and like I said, I think those decisions are always conscious, and there's intent behind them. I'm not sure if that touches exactly on what you mean, Ed, but that's how I understood it anyway. Thanks. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, I have one. I'm interested in this, your sort of, your how-to knowledge, or what we psychologists would call procedural knowledge, and the role of things like sort of muscle memory and muscle pattern memory in all of that, particularly for both of these pieces. It's related to this notion of accuracy of reproduction and so on and so forth. And so I guess the question is, coming back to the piece after times, the role you feel that's being played by what you remember, and how do you reactivate all of those patterns that you've somehow stored in memory and then refine them again to get to the level of accuracy you're trying to achieve?
I'll let you start, but it's almost like that was a plant, because we were literally talking about this right before it wasn't a plant.
Do I have to press anything? No. Yeah, I mean, I think we were both coming back to these pieces after many years of playing. So when I realized this was coming up, I think I hadn't played it since maybe 2018, 2017, 2018. I think for you it was somewhat similar.
2012 was the last time I played this. Yeah.
Oh, wow, okay, yeah. And it surprisingly comes back fast. I mean, there's obviously some like finer things that need fine tuning is maybe a better way of saying it, but the general kind of muscle memory is there. And I think that just comes from building that relationship with the instrument. It goes back to the negotiation between the scorer, the performer, and the instrument. And I think that plays, as performers, that plays a huge role in being able to come back to these pieces.
Sort of like you haven't ridden a bike for 15 years and you
Right.
can still get back on one.
Yeah, it's just like riding a bike. That's what I say to myself. No, it's interesting that you brought that up too, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but in Steve Schick's book, I think there's somewhere he says, and I'm brutally butchering it here, but it's something to do with form being packaged in the formal architecture of a piece is packaged in a performer's body, or he says something like that. I can't quite remember what it is, but it makes total sense when you think about this. Like, it's all in there, and I daren't speak for you, but it came back. It's still there, largely anyway. Yeah, and that's a type of. It's easy to take that for granted, I think, just like the bike. Like that's just something you learn how to do and you can't forget it. But it is the result of hours and years of intense acquisition of knowledge, just in a different way than not necessarily the same as what we describe as analysis, I suppose.
So your body is formed and deformed by all the repertoire you've memorized.
We're worse for wear, yeah.
Any other questions from people up here? Oh, okay.
Thank you both, and thank you, Ben. My question is related to, because you're doing analysis, from paper, and you're doing the analysis from the point of view of the performer. Have you ever been in a situation where they conflict? What you analyze as a performer and what you find, and the way of playing the piece doesn't align with what you find when you put your hat of a pure theoretician of music or composer, and how do you solve that?
Okay. Yeah, you only have one hat? You have two hats. No, you have many hats. Yeah, I guess other than Rebond, I haven't really thought about that in my own playing so much. I think usually when I'm learning a piece, I may do some of that sort of score-based analysis, but then at the moment it ceases to be, that I deem it no longer useful, I stop doing it. But in that study that I mentioned earlier, where I was interviewing those musicians, and in fact, I think all five of them were, so Andrea Stewart was one of them, Julia Denboer, a pianist, Donald Hunt, an organist, Noam Bierstone, percussionist, and Hannah Derrick, a flautist, also all McGillers at some point or another. I think I disagreed with each one of them at some point, or I had come up with something that I thought was really important, and they're like, "No, what are you talking about?" Or they would talk about the same thing, and it would immediately call into question the importance. Not the importance. It's not to say that it diminishes in importance, but it's just sometimes these things really don't speak to each other. And an example I can think of. Off the top of my head from that experience was when Julia and I were talking about Rebecca Saunders' piece Crimson for solo piano, and it begins with these really beautiful languid kind of multi-voiced chords kind of ascending up through the higher register of the piano with tons of pedal, and I was all interested in looking at the voice leading between these because it did seem like it had some, and I could hear it too, and I was kind of stratifying the levels in the part. And there were grace notes, and it got more and more complex as it went. And Julia was like, "No, this is just one gesture. Like, I can't stratify this because it literally is like how my hand has to contort just to get it done." And she can talk about like different pressure of particular fingers, but she always talked about it in this unifying sense. And another example from that too was later in the piece. There's these sort of wild tempo fluctuations. And and sometimes Saunders will add a fermata, and sometimes she'll measure it. Like sometimes it says like 15 seconds pause, and then sometimes there's like 2 bars that are notated with silence. And so I was getting at that too, and I was wondering, what was I was asking Julia what she thought about that, and she's like, you know what, it's honestly for me, it's like skiing on grass. That's what she said to me. She's like, one moment you're just going fast, and then you're not. And so like for her, it was that simple. That's all it was. And that really opened me up to kind of like the little rabbit holes I was going down, I guess. So yeah, I guess that doesn't quite answer internally like whether I've had those experiences, but it really hit me hard when I was having them in these conversations, for sure.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Noam. That was a fantastic talk and maybe the best ending to a music analysis lecture I've ever seen. I was thinking in reference to the graph of the form of difficulty that you had up for Musicologues, that in some sense this approach to analysis and incorporating performer perspectives means that we're not analyzing to find a form, but we're analyzing to find many forms, some of which I may never be able to experience this form as Noam understands it as a percussionist. I actually think I probably will never experience it that way. So what possibilities do you see for a dialogue between different forms, if we're coming up with different forms in our different modes of knowing the piece? I think this has echoes of the last question, actually.
Do you remember what kind of dialogue we had? That might be a good place to start.
No, I don't. But I think maybe what it shows is that it's interesting to have the dialogue, and to have that collaboration with the different perspectives, because, and this again maybe goes back to Fabrice's point, but probably Ben as an individual with the two hats, it's hard for that to come into conflict, because maybe in different situations one will always take the lead, but in a situation like this, each person can come with that concept of form, and they can both be true, and they can then coexist and feed each other, basically. But I don't think you came with like an idea of form when we spoke. I think it was kind of like, what's your
What's
form?
up? Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And I mean, it gets to the, the dialogue. It's not, there's no need to dismay if the points of convergence are small. The fact that they are there is already of immense interest, at least to me. I had a student in Toronto, and so I ran an assignment with, it was a sort of a master's seminar on analysis and performance, and they were all either jazz or classical musicians in the class. And I had a student who did their final project on a David Occupinti solo piece for guitar. It's a dodecaphonic, a 12-tone piece, and his whole thing was tracking where there was musical tension and where there was tension in his fretting hand when he was playing it, and figuring out kind of where these things lined up and where they didn't, and how that mattered to him or made or didn't make sense to him. And I remember kind of what I took away from it anyway. I can't remember, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what I took away from it was just this, that these things do sometimes align and they sometimes don't, and that's fine. And it's really two sides of the same coin at some point. And it's not necessarily a failure or something to worry about when there is this, these sides to it, I guess. Honestly, once we take out the form and make it a form or a structure, it just makes it endlessly appealing, and it opens it up for all these future paths to enjoyment and engagement with it, the piece. I mean, yeah.
Form is multidimensional.
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you guys are amazing masters of your art. Thank you very, very much. I was just wondering, do you think it's important to add a neurological component to this? Brainwave patterns while you're performing? Do you think that's even valid?
Go ahead.
I don't know what I would get from it, but I know that a lot of this work is done, and I think it's very interesting. I don't know the literature well enough. I'm wondering almost if Stephen can answer this better than me, but there is certainly an interest in that. I'm not altogether sure, like in my day-to-day practice, let's say, what knowing that would do for me. I guess I could say. Like, I don't know how it would inform what I do, but it is always interesting to know, like, kind of what you are doing, whether you know that you are doing it explicitly or inherently.
I would be interested in seeing how the patterns change according to the repetition of the music you're doing.
Yeah,
And then you would go back and see the pattern that when you thought you were doing like an amazing, when you're performing, that amazing section, So you could go back and see what the brainwave patterns look like.
Yeah.
To recreate the moment. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's great. And something that is actually even like on the same lines, but even maybe more accessible to performing musicians is even just monitoring your pulse through these things. Because about, again, this is maybe a little insider for the percussionists, but page 5 of that piece, it's quite difficult, but it's really fun too to play. And so I almost wonder if I relax into that in a way because of that. I get to that point. It's the part where it kind of starts grooving a little bit for a moment in there. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if my neurological and biophysical activity changes as a response to that.
Yeah, and I would maybe just add that, we were talking about physical exhaustion, but there's mental exhaustion as well in especially longer pieces and the focus, and that does play into it. For me, for example, in performing the whole piece, that definitely plays into it.
I also think there's from the audience point of view, just seeing performers. Just listening to this piece would be totally different than actually seeing the movements, because I think we internalize to some extent. It's like watching dance.
Yeah.
You start feeling like you're actually moving yourself because all your mirror neurons are going crazy. And so I think that affected a lot my listening, watching you, and starting to feel the gestures and the movements and things like that playing a role. So there's a kind of synchronization that takes place between audience and performer in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's no other way to experience Billone's pieces, to be honest. It's you have to see it.
Any other questions? Alrighty, well, thanks guys for a fantastic presentation and concert.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you, Noam, too. And as is customary, for those of you who are interested in what the notation looks like, come on up, check it out, come and look at the instruments. That often happens. If not, that's fine too. Thanks again for coming.